October 31st, 1926, the restaurant at the Queen's Hotel in Toronto, Canada, was bustling with activity. The debate at Table 6 had been ongoing for quite some time, and everyone eagerly awaited the outcome. On one side sat a young lawyer and a postal officer, while on the other side was a bald old man. They were discussing a legal issue, and after a long, unresolved discussion, the old man, somewhat exasperated, said, "Actually, proving your errors is quite simple. It only takes 2 minutes." The old man continued, "My office is nearby, and it has the most authoritative documents. How about we go and take a look?" Confident and eager, the two young men agreed without hesitation. The old man then added, "Before we test our memory, let's first test our physical strength. Young men, let's see who can get to my office first." As soon as he finished speaking, the old man dashed out like a sprinter. The two young men, taken aback by his unexpected move, immediately followed. They ran to a building on the next street, with the old man leading the way and racing up to the 3rd floor. By the time the two young men caught up and entered the office, the old man was already seated at the desk with an open law book in front of him. Seeing them arrive, he pointed to a specific passage in the book with his right hand. Sadly, before he could taunt the young men, his head slumped forward and his eyes closed. After the sprint, the 70-something-year-old man collapsed and died. The two young men were shocked, unaware that the old man's death would become more significant than his entire life. From that day on, one of the most famous wills in Canadian history was about to be revealed. At that time, most university students came from wealthy families, and it was rare for children of farmers to attend the same school. Some students lived like royalty, while others spent extravagantly. To his classmates, Miller was just a poor country boy. His $5 weekly allowance barely covered his living expenses, leaving no room for social activities. His only entertainment was reading books every day. Surprisingly, this lifestyle turned Miller into an exceptional student. Miller graduated with an impressive average score of 98, quickly becoming a legend at the University of Toronto. Just when he thought he had overcome life's obstacles, he faced another setback. After graduation, his father still wanted him to return to farming and cut off his weekly allowance of $5. Miller found a job at a well-known local law firm, but the stingy capitalists only offered a salary of $3 per week, the highest wage a new graduate could get at the time. Many of Miller's classmates worked essentially for free, and with his meager $3 salary, Miller was nearly starving. This financial strain also led to the end of his romantic relationship. While working at the law firm, Miller met a beautiful and caring young woman. Their relationship progressed quickly, and they began discussing marriage. However, the classic scenario unfolded. The girl's influential father in Toronto learned about Miller's background. Miller realized firsthand what it meant when people say, "The rich marry the rich while the poor watch." His love story ended abruptly. Though Miller didn't enter the big leagues, his post-graduation life was filled with equally fierce challenges. He believed that all his misfortunes stemmed from poverty. An indifferent father, a stingy boss, and a departing girlfriend constantly reminded him of the world's harshness. In response to the world's cold treatment, Miller secretly vowed, "I will make a lot of money and earn the respect of those who look down on me. I will get my revenge on society." Just as the new underdog of Toronto seemed poised to rise, fate dealt him another blow. At his lowest point, Miller's luck changed. After graduation, Miller rented a room at the Queen's Hotel in Toronto. Though the hotel wasn't high-end, Miller couldn't even afford the rent and soon became infamous among the hotel staff, who looked down on him. However, the hotel manager, Mr. McGaw, was very kind to him. Instead of evicting Miller, McGaw allowed him to delay payment for room and board, ensuring he wasn't left homeless. When McGaw learned that Miller had obtained his law license, he entrusted all the hotel's legal affairs to him and introduced Miller to the guests, recommending the young lawyer. With McGaw's support, Miller's career began to flourish. Grateful and dedicated to his work at the Queen's Hotel, Miller's reputation in the legal community soared, becoming as well known as household names like McDonald's or Disney. Known as Miller, the gold medal lawyer, he soon established his own law firm. No longer working for others, Miller remained eternally thankful to McGaw and the Queen's Hotel, providing them with nearly free legal services for the rest of his life. As a lawyer, Miller was always kind and tactful. He once helped a distressed young woman win a blackmail lawsuit, but the defendant fled after being ordered to pay damages. The poor girl, now penniless and desperate, personally approached Miller to ask if she could delay paying the lawyer's fee. In front of her, Miller tore up the bill, waiving all her legal fees, and even offered a reward from his own pocket to bring the culprit to justice. From that point on, the entire city of Toronto regarded Miller as a compassionate and kind-hearted lawyer. In 1897, he bought a struggling courier company and quickly turned it around with his business strategies. After accumulating some capital, he ventured into real estate, innovatively starting with infrastructure development before acquiring land. He ventured into the horse racing industry by purchasing several American racetracks at low prices, dismantling them, and transporting the parts to Canada to build his own racetrack affordably. A few years later, with the onset of Prohibition in the United States, Miller established his own brewery. Through a series of astute business moves, by the turn of the 20th century, Miller had achieved complete financial freedom and became a prominent figure in the local community. In 1901, when his father passed away, Miller felt no emotional impact. He brought his mother to live with him in Toronto, allowing her to enjoy a few years of luxury. From any perspective, Miller's story was both successful and inspirational, one that could be featured in motivational essays. However, contemporaries in Toronto saw him as eccentric. Simply put, no one could quite understand his true character. His attitude toward money was ambiguous. It was hard to say whether he was stingy or generous. On one hand, he waived substantial debts for many poor individuals and sometimes took on legal cases without considering the costs. On the other hand, he never donated a cent to charity, even refusing to contribute $100 when solicited, claiming he still had an elderly mother to support and couldn't afford to be charitable. His lifestyle was equally puzzling. Despite his wealth, Miller had a shocking habit of sleeping on the balcony no matter where he lived, claiming it was to remind himself to stay strong. Yet, calling him frugal wouldn't be accurate either, as he spent lavishly on horse racing and built an extravagant resort for his own enjoyment. Although immensely wealthy, Miller never married or had children. Since the heartbreak of his youth, he seemed to have detached himself from romantic relationships. He maintained a strict routine of going to bed at 10 o'clock every night, even if there were guests at his home. After his parents passed away, he cut off all contact with other relatives, living a solitary and ascetic life. This eccentric tycoon was known for his extreme distrust of human nature. Miller often said that everyone had a price, and once the amount was right, they could be bought. Thus, he spent his life testing people's values for his amusement. For instance, he once circumvented the Canadian court system of summoning witnesses by placing a subpoena in a box labeled, "worth $25." Afterward, Miller smugly declared that the witness's price was precisely $25. Any less, and they wouldn't have been tempted. Any more, and they would have been suspicious. Miller spent lavishly on horse racing and built an extravagant four-person resort in Jamaica. Despite his considerable wealth, he never married or had children. He would simply head to the balcony and fall asleep, leaving others to continue or leave as they wished. He led a highly solitary and disciplined life. For example, in the Canadian legal system, subpoenas had to be delivered through the postal service, but some witnesses would avoid court by refusing to sign for the subpoena. To counter this, Miller personally intervened. He placed the subpoena in a box labeled as containing $25. The witness, unable to resist their curiosity, signed for the package and thus had to appear in court. While this test had a practical purpose, Miller's other antics were purely for fun. One of his favorite pastimes was throwing money off his balcony. He didn't throw large amounts at once, but rather a single bill each time. After it was picked up, he would immediately throw another, observing how passers-by, whether rich or poor, reacted. He was fascinated by this game, believing that nothing revealed a person's character more than money. Additionally, Miller would summon several doctors to his home simultaneously, promising a substantial reward to the first one to arrive, then laugh heartily as they scrambled to get there. This prank angered many, and one lawyer once challenged Miller, asking, "You say everyone has a price. How much are you worth, Mr. Miller?" In response, Miller calmly took a pencil, did some calculations on a piece of paper, and declared, $487,000. If you pay me that amount, you can buy me to do many things, as long as they don't involve death or imprisonment. Miller was a complex and eccentric figure, neither wholly good nor entirely bad. Unlike some notorious pranksters of his time, he didn't cause massive public disturbances. Miller lived in Toronto until his sudden death in 1926, which occurred during a bet in a manner as absurd as his life. Despite the unusual circumstances, Miller's death left a lasting impact on Toronto's history. In the days following his passing, events proceeded normally. On the first day, an obituary was published. On the second day, a funeral service was held, organized entirely by the butler since Miller had no close relatives. Dozens of notable figures attended to pay their respects. On the third day, Miller's body was taken to the church, where the bishop delivered a eulogy, praising Miller's moral excellence and spotless character. Given the circumstances at the time, the bishop's words seemed sincere. No one could have imagined that someone could cause such trouble even after death. After the memorial service, Miller was buried in the family cemetery. On October 31, 1936, exactly 10 years after Miller's death, lawyer Camp obtained the will. It was evident that this will was not hastily written. Miller had meticulously crafted it to withstand court challenges, leveraging his extensive legal expertise to avoid any loopholes. Over the years, many legal experts have attempted to overturn this will, but none have succeeded. From a future perspective, it seems the will had one clear purpose. You are still alive, but I am dead. Why not join me in a life worse than death? At the beginning of the will, Miller engaged in self-mockery, stating, "This will is necessarily uncommon and capricious because I have no dependents or near relations." He intended to prove how much of his lifelong earnings and savings were actually surplus. Unfortunately, although the will became quite famous, I couldn't find the full text. Based on newspaper reports from the time, some parts of the 12 clauses in the will were relatively normal, such as leaving cash to his old butler and $1,000 to the executor of the will. However, beyond these, the contents of the will were quite astonishing. First, Miller left the joint lifetime lease of his luxurious vacation home in Jamaica to 3 fellow lawyers, Gort, Montgomery, and Halverson. The so-called lifetime lease essentially meant the right to use the property for life, but the key term was joint. Miller explicitly stated that the 3 must move in and out together. If one didn't live there, the other 2 couldn't either. While this condition was peculiar, it wasn't entirely unacceptable. The problem was that Miller had chosen 3 individuals who were notorious enemies in the legal community, essentially prone to fighting on sight. The idea of them living under one roof was unimaginable. You might wonder, can't these 3 just refuse to live there and sell the lease instead? Miller had anticipated this. If they decided to sell the lease jointly, all proceeds would go to the poor in Kingston, effectively turning their actions into charity. In the end, the 3 Toronto lawyers decided to bury the hatchet for the sake of tangible benefits and reluctantly headed to Jamaica. Upon arrival, they discovered that the property wasn't in Jamaica at all. Where was it, then? It turned out that Miller had secretly sold the house long before his death, leaving them with nothing but a worthless piece of paper. We don't know how they reacted to this in Jamaica, but this was just the beginning of their troubles. The rest of the will's contents would truly make you question Miller's sanity. The second item in the will stated that Miller decided to divide his shares in the Ontario Jockey Club among 3 individuals. The condition was that after accepting the shares, they must increase their holdings within 3 years. Just like the previous condition, they had to act together. The 3 individuals were William Rainey, Reverend Samuel Johnson, and Abraham Oppen. William Rainey, the Attorney General of Ontario, was known for his staunch opposition to horse racing and his commitment to promoting the prohibition of alcohol and gambling. Reverend Samuel Johnson, a friend of Rainey, shared similar views, advocating for the complete ban of horse racing and alcohol on moral grounds. Leaving the Jockey Club shares to these two moral crusaders was undoubtedly a form of dark humor. Miller anticipated that they would likely refuse to hold the shares, but the real trap was in the association. Whether they donated, transferred, or rejected the shares, they would inevitably be linked to them. The third beneficiary, Abraham Oppen, was a well-known horse racing shareholder. His involvement ensured that the other two would find it impossible to take any action smoothly. Forced into a corner, Rainey and Johnson ultimately chose the lesser of two evils. They refused to accept the Jockey Club shares and used a gap in the handover period to donate their shares, each worth $1,500, to charitable organizations. The charities then officially recorded that William Rainey, Attorney General, and Reverend Samuel Johnson each donated a portion of the Jockey Club shares. Pretty tricky, right? Let's move on to the next item. All Protestant ministers in Toronto and members of the Orange Order were to share Miller's shares in the Ogilvy Brewery, provided they participated in its management. At that time, the Protestant Church in Canada was firmly in favor of prohibition, and Miller forcing them to manage a brewery, which was nominally a Catholic enterprise, was a cruel joke. To execute this part of the will, Executor Camp painstakingly found over 200 members in Toronto willing to accept the shares despite religious pressure. He then discovered that Miller's shares in the brewery were not personally owned by Miller but held in the name of a company. It wasn't until 1928 that an agreement was finally reached to sell these shares and distribute the proceeds. After 2 years of hassle, each member ultimately received an average of $56.38. It's said that after receiving this result, the church members went to Miller's grave to express their appreciation. Could there be anything more devious than this? The next clause stated that every ordained Christian minister in Walkerville, Sandwich, and Windsor would receive shares in the Kenilworth Park racetrack. Given Miller's previous antics, this seemed almost trivial. However, when 5 ministers bravely stepped forward in October 1928 to claim their shares, they discovered that anti-racing campaigns over the past 2 years had nearly obliterated the industry. The racetrack shares were practically worthless, estimated to be worth less than a penny each, essentially leaving them as mere souvenirs. The sight of 3 lawyers reconciling over a house they didn't own and 5 ministers uniting to inherit virtually worthless shares became iconic scenes, providing Canadians with endless amusement. However, at that time, they had no idea how impactful the final clause of the will would be. Despite the earlier clauses causing the inheritors to run in circles, Miller's wealth was substantial. Upon his death, his movable and immovable assets were valued at over $1 million. To put things in perspective, during the same era, Leduc spent approximately $9 million of his fortune on substantial endeavors, including efforts to overthrow the Portuguese government. Now, imagine the impact of $1 million. It was like getting a massive discount during a popular online shopping event. So, where did the bulk of his wealth go? Miller further detailed special circumstances, such as ensuring the children were registered in Toronto and specifying that in the event of a tie, the money would be divided equally among the mothers. When this clause was revealed, it caused a nationwide sensation in Canada. The idea of a baby race to win an inheritance was seen as a massive ethical and moral challenge, potentially leading to severe social issues. These questions led Canadians to view the clause as a posthumous prank by a wealthy eccentric, and initially, no one took it seriously enough to participate. However, just 3 years later, the global Great Depression of 1929 hit, dramatically changing public perception. The key clause in Miller's will stated, "All remaining parts and residues of my estate, wherever situated, shall be converted into cash at the discretion of my appointed executors and trustees, and then distributed. After a 10-year period following my death, the mother in Toronto who has given birth to the most children shall receive it." Miller also specified that the children must be registered in Toronto to count. If there was a tie, the money would be divided among the mothers. When this will was made public, it caused an uproar across Canada. Such a baby-making contest posed significant ethical challenges and could easily lead to moral catastrophes. For instance, women might have illegitimate children with multiple partners to increase their chances. Moreover, would children who died shortly after birth count? If so, some families might go to the extreme of registering infants and then letting them die to avoid the burden of raising them. Canadians found this will utterly absurd, dismissing it as a rich man's posthumous prank. Initially, no one took it seriously, and there were no immediate participants after the will was announced in 1926. The economic crisis profoundly affected everyone within the capitalist system. Despite the initial buzz around Miller's will dying down after the Depression began, the Toronto city government inadvertently revived its relevance. By 1932, troubled by distant relatives of Miller repeatedly suing to inherit the estate, the government decided to quietly pass legislation to overturn the will and allocate the estate to themselves. This move met strong opposition from the will's executor, lawyer Camp. Extensive media coverage led to the government's failure and reignited public interest in the will, prompting serious discussions about its feasibility. During the Depression, journalists were highly competitive and eager for sensational stories. This led to a media frenzy, with reporters scouring the city to interview large families about their potential participation in the childbearing contest. This coverage inadvertently heightened awareness among the poor. At that time, ordinary people were unaware of the exact value of Miller's estate, but relentless media reports convinced them that winning the inheritance could change their lives. To illustrate the impact, let's consider the Kenny family, heavily covered by the media. Mrs. Kenny was well known in her community for having many children. By the time the competition results were to be announced in 1936, Mrs. Kenny was already the mother of 16 children, 11 of whom met the criteria set by Miller's will. She was confident she would be the ultimate winner of this baby-making contest. She even told the media that Miller had appeared in her dream, assuring her of victory. With this confidence, Mrs. Kenny had numerous statues made, telling the media she was certain of her win. However, as the contest gained more attention, the Kenny family's secrets started to unravel. Another participant, Mrs. Aubame, informed the media that one of Kenny's children had died from an infection caused by a rat bite due to neglect. Almost overnight, Mrs. Kenny went from being a top contender to a widely despised figure, seen as a woman who would sacrifice her children's lives for money and was now considered unworthy of the prize. At that time, Mr. Kenny had been unemployed for over 3 years with no income. Mrs. Kenny, having given birth to what felt like an entire soccer team, had to stay home to care for the children, and the family could only survive on welfare. The Kenny family's situation was a microcosm of what many families went through as a result of participating in this contest. Starting in 1932, when the Ontario government attempted to nullify the will, the event drew significant media attention. Many impoverished families appeared in newspapers, desperately hoping to inherit Miller's fortune. However, the contest only deepened their despair. The plight of the Kenny family shocked both the Canadian Supreme Court and the will's executor, Camp. Although the will could not be legally overturned, the authorities felt compelled to take action. The Supreme Court quickly issued additional conditions. Children had to be alive at the end of the contest, they had to be legitimate, and could not be born out of wedlock. With these validations and the media frenzy, the baby-making contest reached new heights. Beyond the allure of the substantial prize, the ethical and privacy-invading aspects of the contest captivated both the media and the public. Reporters scoured the city for large families to cover, and newspapers provided daily updates on their chosen contestants. This transformed the desperate atmosphere of the Great Depression in Toronto into a bizarre celebration. Despite the high level of interest, the contest did not see widespread participation. Having children is not something that can be rushed, and by the time the will gained traction in 1932, there were only 4 years left until the results were announced. Ultimately, only about 40 families officially entered the contest. By 1935, the Kenny family was leading with 11 children, followed by 2 families with 9 children each, and 5 families with 8 children each. As the contest deadline of October 31, 1936, approached, there was a surprising twist. Several other women, known as Mrs. X and Mrs. A, realized their large family sizes made them contenders and entered the competition. Eventually, the executor and judges determined that 6 families had qualified, with some claiming to have at least 10 children each. Due to ongoing disputes, the prize money was not distributed until 1938. The stories of the finalist families revealed a wide range of human experiences. First, let's talk about the Kenny family. Over the past decade, the Kenny couple had 11 children, although 3 were stillborn. However, due to extreme poverty, by the end of the competition, 5 of these children had died. According to the competition rules, their family had already lost eligibility, but the prize money was their only hope, so they kept fighting in court. Another strong contender was the Bagnet family, who were quite extraordinary. For them, participating in the competition was just a side activity. They were the kind of family that would make the family planning office want to revoke their household registration. By 1936, Mrs. Bagnet had given birth to a total of 23 children, 10 of whom were born in the last decade. Because they were top contenders, Mrs. Bagnet was reported by Mrs. Kenny for allegedly not registering her children. In response, the Bagnet family simply withdrew from the competition. Being wealthy, they had planned to have many children regardless of the competition and did not care about the prize money. Among the top contenders was a woman who wished to remain anonymous, referred to as Mrs. Clark. She had 10 children, all of whom survived, making her the undisputed champion. Pauline Clark had 10 children, 5 with her first husband and 5 with another man, which led to her disqualification. After months of rigorous verification, none of the families won the contest. Ultimately, Lawyer Capro and the court decided that 4 families, each with 9 children, would share the prize money. As the media had predicted, the poor could not win this competition. These 4 families were at least middle class. The reason for this outcome was the 10-year gap from when Miller wrote the will to when the prize was distributed. The poor could not afford to have one child after another without going bankrupt, and even if they could, raising them would be difficult. The final outcome was unacceptable to the Kenny family and Mrs. Clark, who had risked everything. Encouraged by the media and lawyers, they launched lawsuits but did not win. They only received a consolation prize of $12,500. A paltry sum compared to their costs and efforts. So, how much did the winners actually receive? In May 1938, after 12 years of turmoil, the baby-making contest finally concluded. Due to complications and the economic downturn of the Great Depression, each winning family received only $12,500, roughly equivalent to $2 million today. Although $2 million might seem substantial by today's standards, it was intended to support 9 children. Moreover, this money was subject to deductions for government relief payments, leaving the winners feeling shortchanged. Despite having more than 9 children, some mothers were still denied a chance at the prize. Those who had 7 or 8 children just for the competition received nothing and fell into deeper despair. Canadians at the time showed remarkable restraint. In the U.S., Miller's remains would likely have been desecrated. Ironically, those who entered the competition hoping to change their fate did not succeed. After more than a decade of farce, poor families remained poor, and the middle class stayed middle class. This story highlights that the shackles of fate are tightly bound around everyone, and breaking free is incredibly difficult. The most ironic part of this story is that everyone who participated with the hope of changing their fate ultimately failed to do so. Nothing much changed. The children born into the Kenny family, used as pawns in the competition, couldn't receive a proper education, leading to bleak futures. In contrast, the wealthy Bagnet family, who had over 20 children, ensured their kids received a decent education, with one even becoming a senator. In the game Fallout, there's a phrase, "The vaults do not save anyone." The Vault Project in Fallout is a grand social experiment, akin to Miller's last will and testament, which was essentially a massive prank. If there's any positive takeaway from Miller's dark comedy, it's that we can't expect to change our fate through miracles without putting in the effort. In the battle of life, the only way to break free from our cages is through our own hard work.